Hi, I'm Hipólita Siqueira, and this is the second part of my interview with Jamie Peck in Vancouver. Jamie, it's a real pleasure to have you back. Shall we begin?
Yes, glad to be here.
Mm-hmm. Jamie, in the last decade, many scholars have been claiming that a platform capitalism is emerging. What's your take on that?
I think that's been a very interesting literature on platform capitalism. One of the things that I would note about it is that in some respects, geographers have been quick to analyze and speculate about the shape of platform capitalism. And I think that reflects the fact not that necessarily that they have specific skills in that area, although that probably applies to some degree, but because economic geographers tend to pay particular attention to the emergent form of capitalism, to the latest waves of reform and transformation. As I like to say, the optic of the economic geographer is the restructuring present. And so that means that economic geographers were often quick to arrive on the scene to talk about post-Fordism, flexibilization of the economy, financialization, and so on. And likewise, it's also been the case that geographers have been quick to work on emergent forms of platform capitalism. And I think what it raises is this question about whether platforms might be considered a new modality of capitalism, a new organizational principle of capitalism, or whether they are some sort of extension of extended forms of financialization, which I think is a strong argument can be made that we can really only understand platforms in the context of deep financialization of the economy. Interestingly, the mainstream discussions about platforms tend to be preoccupied with technological revolution kind explanations. They would speculate about how it's essentially a technology-driven wave of innovation. But I think, in contrast to that, where there's a lot of exaggerated and inflated rhetoric, it's more appropriate to examine the platform phenomenon as an organizational transformation, one related to financialization. And as Rachel Phillips and I have recently argued in a paper in Sociologica, in many respects, platform capitalism echoes Brauddel's arguments about the character of capitalism going back for centuries, in that it is not necessarily a function of marketization or elaborations of the market, but instead an illustration of how capitalism tends to operate above the market, as Braudel so well argued, that the true home of capitalism is with monopoly and with the big beasts of the economy, as Braudel characterized them. In many respects, that seems to be where platforms really reside, is sort of above the market, in the space of monopolization, and in the space of state power and economic power. So the argument that Rachel Phillips and I made was, well, in many respects, it's a challenge to think about which template we might hold up to the platform phenomena. By what criteria do we start to analyze it? We found that to analyze it as a modality of capitalism in the Braudel schema seemed to be quite appropriate. It called attention to platforms not as some kind of super version of markets or some radically new technology with no precedents, but instead as a continuation of of forms of capitalist power exercised through monopoly. Now, that's of course not to say that platforms today are directly equivalent to 16th century trading houses or something. That will be rather silly to claim. But in many respects, they exist in a lineage with those earlier forms of capitalist power.
I think it's very interesting, this connection with Brodel's perspective, instead of pay attention only to the technological side of things. And now I want to know, what led you to the work of Karl Polanyi in your research?
I first encountered Polanyi in the mid-80s via the work of Klaus Offi. Klaus Offi's book, Disorganized Capitalism, was one that I found extremely persuasive, and Offi made quite a bit of use of Polanyi there. And so I suppose I read Polanyi first as when I was looking for explanations for the changing forms of regulation in the economy, and Polanyi's work on fictitious commodities and so on set up very well, I think, the problem of labour markets and how labour regulation is a perennial problem under capitalism, for which there are no stable or secure solutions. So it seemed to be a very effective way of approaching that question of why labour regulation is such a volatile and contradictory field. So I suppose my first reading of Polanyi was through in order to understand questions of regulation. I guess I would read him again, or in a different sort of way, in the debates around the status of neoliberalism that Adam Tikel and I started to get into in the early 90s, where Polanyi seemed to provide a support for the argument that deep forms of marketization and liberalization didn't anticipate a new form of regulation or institutional stability, but rather spoke to continuing crisis conditions and so on. And I think we can read Polanyi as a critic of neoliberal globalization before the phenomenon itself, in a sense, is critiques of 19th century capitalism have lots of echoes for the period of neoliberal globalization. In particular, the notion of a double movement, which is, I think, in Polanyi is often read in a sort of curious way. There are readings of the double movement that seem to set it up as if it's like a pendulum that swings backwards and forwards, a pendulum that swings back and forwards between marketization and social protection from the market. And I actually don't think that was Polanyi's initial intention. Because what he actually said about how the double movement operated was that, yes, marketization was likely to go too far to trigger contradictions and externalities and social and ecological destruction. If you like, that's the first element of the double movement. The reactions against marketization and liberalization, Polanyi emphasized, though, could take many different forms. That would be entirely a matter of politics, how the response to marketization took shape. And so it might produce the New Deal in some locations and fascism in others, and no doubt other possibilities existed historically and today. So the double movement, I think, is while it's sometimes misread, does sort of alert us to the fact that liberalization projects and marketization projects will very often go, as it were, too far and reach over into social and ecological destruction, and likely produced all kinds of social and political responses. The form of those responses, though, is political, not mechanical. So I think, again, Polanyi gives us some good indications about how to analyze neoliberalization as a rolling process of transformation that's got contradictions constantly on the inside, not as some stable settlement or regulatory or mode of regulation that is somehow secure or even in the medium term. So Polanyi was very useful, I think, for that. And I'd just say, thirdly, a third way of which I read Polanyi, which is a kind of different one, and I think has been inspiring to me in a different sort of way, is to read the post-war, post-Second World War Polanyi, and the projects that he pursued after he moved to North America after the Second World War, which are less well known, in some respects a bit more cryptic and difficult to follow, and different in content to the Great Transformation, which was very polemical and powerful. The post-war Polanyi was concerned to set up a project that he called comparative economy, which he saw as a interdisciplinary or post-disciplinary project that will bring together, especially in his view, economic historians and economic anthropologists. But today, we'd certainly add to that list economic sociologists, many institutional political economists, I would say economic geographers as well would have the same interest in a form of heterodox economic inquiry that is deeply historical and deeply comparative. And what Polanyi called comparative economy was, in many respects, it was the last project that he pursued during his working career, right towards the end of his life in the 50s and early 60s. So it was very much incomplete. But the ideas behind that, I think, can be read as an open-ended agenda for a different kind of comparative research. That, as Polanyi emphasized, you would work across different formations of economic organization, or modes of integration, as he called them. He identified market exchange, redistribution, often associated with the state, but not necessarily, and reciprocity as the three main ones, but also added householding as a fourth form in some of the things that he wrote. Polanyi argued that those different forms of economic organization exist side by side in most real-world, actually existing economic systems. So there's been lots of examples of the market, but they often will coexist with other forms in complex ways. So in that respect, we could think of Polanyi as one of the original theorists of diverse economies, pluralized economies. I mean, it really opens up that agenda for us to think about, for us to analyze markets amongst their others, for example. And to focus, as Polanyi always did, on his substantivist method of studying concrete socioeconomic forms as the means to sort of build out this repertoire of economic difference. He argued that you would constantly use explorations of current and past economic forms to sort of fill out and substantiate that repertoire of economic difference, and to use comparative methods especially to elucidate different hybrid forms, different trajectories, where there was never for Polanyi a single dominant centre, even if there might be hegemonic power. There was always more going on in the economy. The economy was never reducible to the market form. And so I think that kind of later reading of Polanyi that I really only started to do in the last 10 years, I would say, for me has opened up a research agenda, which is an ongoing one. It's really Polanyi's unfinished work. And that strikes me as a very exciting agenda, and one where if we're to pursue it, we'd have to do it in the spirit of what I tend to call Polanyi plus, Polanyi with other theorists. And there's a tradition to read Polanyi on his own as an alternative to Marx in some cases, although many will persuasively argue that Polanyi was never anti-Marxist. His relationship to Marxism was complicated. I don't think he was ever an anti-Marxist. So, why not read Polanyi along with Marx, along with Schumpeter, along with other currents in heterodox thinking. I don't think he provides everything we need, but especially methodologically, he provides a very open agenda and a way to explore economic difference, which I think is, in many respects, the main challenge that faces economic geographers, but also a lot of political economists as well.
Mm-hmm. Right. Continuing this topic, could you elaborate on your project about marketization as explored in the book Market/Place?
Yeah, that book in many ways exactly picked up this theme that I just talked about, which is the unfinished business of Polanyi's work, or neo-Polanyian scholarship. And it's a book that came out of a workshop that I organised with Christian Berndt and Norma Antisi in 2017 at the Polanyi Institute in Montreal. And we invited a number of heterodox political economists and sociologists and anthropologists and geographers to that meeting, with an agenda to explore what we called actually existing markets, and to develop a language and a set of methodologies to explore that. And we, in our invitation letter, we said you don't have to be a card-carrying Polanyi scholar to attend this meeting, but we think Polanyi and Polanyian scholarship provides an interesting terrain for a conversation, in that Polanyi was never dogmatic. He actually believed in relatively pluralistic, eclectic explorations. And as the project on comparative economy that I just talked about was exactly set up as an interdisciplinary one. So we'd like to think it was the sort of project that he would have approved of, as it were. And so it was both to sort of carry forward this idea of studying actually existing markets amongst their others and in different forms of hybridity, but also to address the fact that Polanyi's work on the market was really quite seriously unfinished. One of the things that is a bit curious about Polanyi, I think, is he spends more time talking about the others to the market than he does about the market itself. In some respects, while he had a polemical critique of the market, he didn't do a lot of work on different forms that market economies could take in the contemporary world. He did some work on that historically, but not so much in the contemporary economy. And that's because, I think there's complicated reasons for that. There are some persuasive arguments that one of the reasons that Polanyi didn't delve more into the contemporary economy was that he was working in the United States under the period of McCarthyism, where there was a great deal of skepticism about radical economic scholarship. And so that meant he tended to be a bit more selective about his post-war research program. So it seemed to be entirely consistent with his project that he would explore actually existing markets in all of their diversity. But he never got to do that himself. So the project in the Marketplace book is really dedicated to the task of trying to open up that agenda again. And it reflects the fact I think for a lot of critical, heterodox economists and political economists, markets are sort of no-go areas. It's what orthodox economists do, and we tend to not go there or be very skeptical about whether markets have got any logic or structure to them, and instead focus on, let's say, the state or the labour process or other moments in economic transformation. So for various reasons, the critical study of markets has been a bit stunted and underdeveloped, which we thought needed to be addressed. It's also the case that we felt there wasn't a vocabulary, like a conceptual vocabulary, to address the question of, well, how do we characterize the variety of actually existing market forms? There's a really overwhelming orthodox response to that, which is you compare them to an idealized market, and how the distance they are away from that is how we judge out what the market is. So the US economy is supposed to be nearer to a textbook neoclassical version of a market. The German and Chinese economies are further from it. So there's this basically degrees of marketness would be the orthodox, which I think is just a terrible way of thinking about markets. Not least because it holds on to the idea of a free market as one end of the spectrum, and it elides that with American liberal capitalism, despite all of the contradictions between that and free markets. So one of the things that we try to do in the book is to think about markets beyond the dominant sort of neoclassical image or classical image of the free market. And if we agree that we should throw that out as a utilitarian ideal rather than a guide to any real markets, the more tricky question is, with what do we replace it? How do we actually characterize markets if none of them look like an idealized free market? How do we actually divide up markets in reality? By what criteria do we do that? And that seemed to us to be a really quite radically open set of questions around that, and we don't have an adequate language yet to describe the bases on which markets differ from one another, the criteria for determining the diversity and variety of markets, none of which is really present at the moment. So that book is an attempt to move that discussion along and ideally open it up as a interdisciplinary project.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating. Throughout your publications, you make quite a compelling argument on the need to develop new ways to theorize with and across difference. What do you mean by that?
I suppose this is it's an article of faith in some respects for geographers that the economy over here is different to the economy over there. We kind of believe that. Although I recognise that we have not been very successful at convincing other parts of the sort of economic studies field to buy that argument. Most heterodox economic scholars accept that the economies differ from one nation state to another. And that kind of habit of methodological nationalism to find difference at the scale of the nation state, but not think of looking for it at any other scale, is one of the things that irritates geographers. But at the same time, I think we have to recognize that we haven't persuaded people who are open-minded to these questions, how economic difference might work in different registers to just contrast between one national economy and another. So, in many respects, the comparative advantage for economic geographers methodologically is to work out the local and regional and urban scales, and to conduct first-hand investigations at that scale. We study cities and regions for the large part. So we work at lower scales of analysis. That's our comfort level, I think, and where economic geographers do good work. But we also have a habit and perhaps a preference as geographers to always make the argument that the world's more complex than our theories of it, which I think is always true, but in a rather banal and boring way. Of course, it is more complex than our theories. You'll often move debates in the social sciences by providing kind of strong and clear arguments that can be stylized and can travel into other disciplines. For various reasons, economic geographers don't tend to do that. They tend to produce rather complex, context-laden arguments that I would argue kind of repay careful reading. but you've got to be really already sympathetic to some of those arguments in order to do that. And I think that even works for the very best scholarship in our field. Doreen Massey's Spatial Division of Labour, for example. Spatial Divisions of Labour is a fabulous book, in many respects one of the most important in our field in the last several decades. The arguments, though, are constructed in a very context-specific way through the specificities of regional development in the United Kingdom in the 70s and early 80s. There's a lot of contextual material in there. And those arguments can't easily be separated from that contextual material. So I think the challenge for economic geographers who believe in grounded, deeply contextualized forms of economic analysis and exposition is how we present those in ways that they can, travel into other fields and influence sociologists, political scientists, institutional economists, and so on, who might be open to some of these arguments, but for various reasons, I don't think economic geography has yet developed the vocabulary of accounting for economic difference in a systematic way. That's not to say, I think we would still argue that we've got that we're making a strong case, but how that is pursued is really challenging. And I think one of the things that's been interesting in the last decade or so is the way in which other disciplines have discovered or rediscovered uneven development as a kind of principle of economic, of the very ontology of the economy. And that's, again, been a sort of staple in geography. But the real theoretical work on uneven development in geography was largely stopped in the 1980s. There was a Doreen Massey version of it. There was a David Harvey and Neil Smith version of it. Harvey and Smith argued from the sort of abstract dynamics of capitalism. Doreen Massey argued up through regional formations and a more contextualized version. So we've got these two varieties of arguments around uneven development. For various reasons, geographers took that for granted, I think, after the 1990s. And interestingly, in the last 10 years, it's been anthropologists, international relations scholars, and sociologists and development theorists that have picked up uneven development again and started to ask questions about how fundamental that might be to understand the contemporary economy. I would say largely prompted by the fact that it's absolutely clear that we're not moving towards a sort of state of globalized convergence anymore. You don't need to be a believer in economic geography now to be skeptical about the claim that the world is converging. I don't think that it doesn't look like it's converging. The BRICS economies are not converging towards a liberal model of market capitalism. They're diverging from that and are diverging as a group. So we've got actually existing uneven development extremely boldly demonstrated to us. So what is the theoretical apparatus, conceptual apparatus that's appropriate for dealing with those questions? This new literature in anthropology, international relations, development studies, and so on tends to go back to Trotsky and to really try to rethink the principles of uneven development. I think a lot of that's been very interesting. And one of the things that I would take from it, especially from Justin Rosenberg, an IR scholar at Sussex University, is his point. Rosenberg makes the point that uneven development implies an ontology of more than one. It means that there's always more than one economic form. Whatever economic form that you are looking at, it exists in a world of difference that exceeds that case. So the world isn't going to converge on a form of American-style capitalism, or indeed move towards a sort of bipolar world defined by the United States or China or the US or Germany or whatever. The nature of the shape of and the terrain of economic difference is being reshaped in real time now. And so these questions are on the agenda again, and properly so. So that it means that you wouldn't start to explore economic difference using ideal types or models of the economy that imply convergence or dominant centers, but instead you'd want to explore multipolarity, multi-speed economic development, multiple pathways and their coexistence. And to go back to Polanyi, one of the things that he did very late in life was to found a journal called Coexistence, which was about the coexistence of different economic forms in a heterogeneous world. And I think those kinds of principles of heterogeneity are the fundamental ones when it comes to renewing concepts of uneven and combined development. And it's no coincidence that there was a spurt of active theorizing around that in the 1970s and 80s with the crisis of Fordism and the rise of Asian competition to the West and so on. As Neil Smith said, that was a time when the gestalt of capitalism was changing. Like the old order seemed to be breaking up and getting disrupted in real time. And I think it's felt a bit like that again since 2010 or so, since the global financial crisis and the periods of instability since. It feels again like the capitalist order is being restructured quite radically, and that complacent arguments about convergence and so on no longer apply if they ever applied. So it kind of makes sense that these questions are back on the agenda again. But as I was saying earlier, like how you actually grapple with economic difference as a methodological problem, what you actually do remains really quite challenging. It suggests itself, obviously, to do comparative work. But it's easy to say that, much easier to say that than to do it. And really, I think we also need to move beyond traditional forms of comparison that just hold cases side by side and compare their characteristics. I think geographers like Gillian Hart have this notion of relational comparison where you will explore the connections between cases rather than imagine them to be sort of isolated examples in a world where they just exist side by side, as in the varieties of capitalism, where it's assumed that the two main models of capitalism are relatively independent from one another. That form of comparison, it seems to me, isn't especially valuable. But what Hart suggests is that we instead explore connections across cases, connections across conjunctures and so on, where you might begin with a large, complex case, let's say like contemporary Brazil, but spiral out of that, exploring different kinds of causal connections that might take you to China or to wherever. It suggests a more adaptive methodology that really is, it might be grounded fundamentally in a territorial case, but seeks to exceed that territorial case, exceed the conjuncture that you're working in most proximately. And I think there's some very interesting work now that's trying to do that. And I think that's one of the reasons why the language and practices of conjunctural methodologies have again been brought into currency and active discussion. It's no coincidence that they come in to focus again at the same time as people are thinking about uneven development, at the same time as the world order itself seems to be getting scrambled. I think all of those are connected.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it seems challenging, but it's very exciting. Now, Jamie, turning to urban discussions, your work on what's being called austerity urbanism is quite influential. What's your perspective on this topic?
That was something that I had kind of tumbled into without any particular intention of working on that question. I'd initially planned to write a little editorial about the impact of the financial crisis on cities and think of that in terms of austerity. But as I started to work on that, it became clear that this wasn't a sort of cyclical phenomenon by any means. Neither was it easily understood from one location. So the language of austerity, for example, was very much mainstream in European discussions after the financial crisis, particularly in connection to Greece and other southern European economies that were effectively being structurally adjusted within the EU according to the principles of austerity. So there's a language of austerity that circulated in Europe. The British government effectively declared austerity to be its official policy under the Conservative coalition. So there's a language there. In the United States, however, austerity was something that happened in Europe. It wasn't something that happened in the United States. Yet at the same time, many of the cities and states themselves were on the brink of bankruptcy and going through what you would call actually existing austerity, even if that word wasn't particularly in circulation. in the political discussions or amongst analysts. So that it kind of presented itself, I would say, as a sort of conjunctural problem. In some respect, you've got the effects of the financial crisis were present in many economies. They were certainly present in the North American and the European economies very vividly in 2010 or so. But the shape that it took and the politics of that process were rather different in the US compared to Europe. And so that investigation that I said was originally intended to be a relatively short project, turned out to be a larger one, which was to explore how it was that austerity seemed effectively normalized within the American political system. That it was like happened almost automatically, that the pain of financial cuts trickled down from the federal to the state to the urban to the local scales, and that the principles of the US political economy, those of devolution and fiscal federalism, were designed to do that. The US system allows cities and local municipal authorities to go bankrupt, but not states. So states aren't allowed to go bankrupt by the Constitution, but cities and municipalities can do. And so that was again a manifestation of how the kind of pain of adjustment of austerity moved through the scalar system down to the urban and regional and local scales, was deflected away from the federal scale. And that echoed the ways also in which the pain of adjustment in austerity programs in Europe was also visited on the victims of austerity. It was the Greek economy and the Greek people that had carried the burden of adjustment after the financial crisis. So austerity, the pain of austerity tends to trickle down. Austerity, as I wrote about then, is something that the powerful do to less powerful interests. Austerity is something that you apply to weaker parties. And that was also, I think, a good illustration of the way in which scale works in the urban and regional system. The logic of austerity in the US model, which is the one that I worked most on, was embedded in the federal settlement itself. So the way that Detroit, for example, went through its bankruptcy was conditioned by that federal system. In a sense, it was built into the federal model itself and to the model of state financing, even though the discussions that we tend to have about Detroit's bankruptcy tend to focus on the actions of local political leaders, mistakes supposedly made by the municipal government there. Bankruptcy is something that, so the account goes, you bring on yourself by being profligate, incompetent, corrupt, and so on. So there's a localization of the narrative of the causes for austerity or crisis, even though closer analysis reveals this is sort of built into the federal system, that the pain is going to get dumped down onto the lowest scale available. So austerity urbanism then became a kind of framework or a sort of mid-level concept, if you like, to think about the different shapes of financial crisis at the urban and regional scale, and how they work them, how they reflected different political settlements and so forth. And what the American experience showed was that that the bankruptcies that took place in Detroit, the near bankruptcy of Atlantic City, and several California jurisdictions, they had these kind of common characteristics to them, even though they were stories usually told about the failures of local political leaders or the fact that public servants were paid too much in these places, which is an absurd claim, or that the pensions paid to retired school teachers were the reasons for the financial crisis. There are these very strong conservative narratives about the causes of economic crisis that work on austerity, urbanism, sort of tried to expose for what it is, which is a kind of misdirection of the real causes of austerity. So it turned out to be a rather longer-term research program than I'd imagined. And in some respects, what austerity also showed was another example of the way in which neoliberalization proceeds through fits and starts. It especially reconstitutes itself during crises and is constantly, as I've argued, failing forward and producing new forms of institutional governance and political responses to each crisis. So while there were some commentators who thought that the financial crisis of 2008 would be the end of neoliberalism, our expectation rather was that it would reconstitute itself through that crisis, that the neoliberal project would be able to take advantage of the crisis. And I think that's exactly what happened. It was progressive forces that found it most difficult to operate after the crisis, to make a case for increased budgets and so on, or new social programs or new environmental programs in a context of austerity is nearly, it's extremely difficult. Meanwhile, conservative politicians who, with an interest in cutting programs and restricting budgets, find the wind at their backs in periods of austerity. So it provide a tactical advantage for the politics of the right, and really explains why the period after the financial crisis was one of the renewal of the neoliberal project, not its death. It reconstituted itself through austerity. And as we also argued, the period of austerity after 2008 differed from the period of austerity that marked the beginning of the neoliberal moment in countries like the UK, where the Thatcher government, we used to call that the cuts. The cuts that the Thatcher government applied were cuts applied to the residue of the Keynesian welfare state. Thatcher was cutting back the Keynesian welfare state. After the crisis of 2008, austerity was applied to a neoliberalized state, with fewer and fewer residues of those Keynesian welfarist institutions left. So I've said that you could think of austerity as like a medieval cure where the doctor applies leeches to the patient and the leeches suck the blood from the patient, and that's supposed to help the patient recover. Of course, it usually kills the patient. The leeches of austerity were applied to a different patient after the crisis of 2008 to the patient that existed in the late 1970s or the 1980s. So even if the routines that are used in neoliberal reforms have family resemblances, so neoliberals will always attack the social state. They will always make the case for budgetary restraint, especially on social and environmental programs. They will do that every time. But the context in which they do that constantly shifts, and therefore the outcomes of neoliberal projects and programs will be context specific. And that's another example, I think, again, of the way in which neoliberalization has both got elements of a repeating repertoire, but is associated with different political projects and outcomes as it rolls along, because it's being applied in a changing world, and it also has its own sort of limitations and internal contradictions. So the austerity question seemed like a specific one, but it actually kind of opened up all of those wider issues.
Mm-hmm. Now, I'd like to ask one final question to you. Do you think we can connect this debate about uneven development, uneven spatial development, with the critical Latin American theories of underdevelopment and dependency?
Yes, I do. And to be honest, I think if the new wave of work on uneven development, what you might call uneven development 2.0, the 21st century versions of that, if they don't really engage with a world of economic differences, including those found in Latin America, across Asia, in Africa, and so on, then they clearly aren't fit for the purpose. The versions of uneven development that were popularized in the 1980s, in some respects, were predicated on a pretty narrow set of questions focused on declining regions in the global north, especially in North America and Western Europe. So that kind of first revival of uneven development was prompted by a set of contextual questions focused on the global north. Hardly any of that literature made connections to dependency theory, to world systems theory. Those connections weren't really made in the 1980s, although they clearly could have been made, but they weren't. I think this time around, as it were, that's got to be different. And I think the questions that are being asked about uneven development and combined development, which I think is, in many respects, one of the more interesting parts of that formula, which often gets forgotten. How are different things being combined, rather than just being different and uneven? What forms of combination are we seeing? The spectrum of combination is clearly shaped by a diverse world of cases, absolutely including those in Latin America, and so I think the kind of new agenda for uneven development has got to be a more global and deeply comparative one, and hopefully will continue the kind of recuperation and learning from the traditions of dependency theory and world systems theory, and some of which went out of fashion in some circles in the late 20th century, but now seem essential to understanding these contemporary problems. And I think, at least with my students, I encourage them to go back to that literature and to think about it in the context of contemporary issues, rather than regarding it as something from that belonged in the 20th century. I think that it all ought to inform this new research agenda around uneven and combined development, and especially it has things to say about the entanglements of colonial, post-colonial, and kind of non-imperial, or however we categorize the global China activities, for example, which probably don't fit into some simple categories of colonialism and imperialism and so on. They may be stretching that register. There are many different forms of global interdependencies now that are different to those in the 20th century, and that require, a bold and open-ended research agenda that would include comparative and conjunctural investigations that span greater forms of difference than the 1980s versions of uneven development did, which was this rather restricted global north treatment of those questions.
Mm-hmm. Jamie, we have to wrap it up. Thank you so much for taking your time for this interview. I think it's been a very interesting and thought-provoking conversation, and it will no doubt open the door to new ideas and channels of dialogues.
Well, I've enjoyed it, and I very much hope that it does that, and that we can continue the conversation in this and in other ways in the years ahead.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Bye.
Okay, thank you very much.